This video was always going to be about turn-based games, but it was originally going to be a little more pessimistic. From the research I was gathering, there was compelling evidence supporting the idea that the audience for traditional turn-based games may have been diminishing, or at least not growing in size. But then, Expedition 33 released and has had quite tremendous success, and has now made me question my original thinking. Though I'm no longer quite as pessimistic, the success of one game does not quell all the concerns I have. It's not that simple. When talking about turn-based games and if they're dying or thriving, it's really neither, and it's quite complicated. Now, a few disclaimers. First off, when I'm talking about turn-based, I am mostly discussing the traditional turn-based style of game, this one here. Many games can technically be turn-based, but I'm mainly focusing my concerns on the traditional turn-based games. Second, all the games I'm going to be talking about are considered incredibly successful, as the budgets for these turn-based games are much lower than AAA titles. So without further ado, let's talk about why I was, and still am, concerned. My worries and evidence lies in the sales of these games. Let's start with Square Enix. Though many call attention to Final Fantasy becoming more action-based, they still have their turn-based games that are critically acclaimed. Octopath Traveler 1 and 2 together surpassed 5 million copies as of a few months ago. The Bravely Default series has sold over 3 million copies, and though this report is a few years old, there hasn't been any notable sales updates. Dragon Quest III Remake also surpassed 2 million in sales when last reported, and the Final Fantasy 1-6 Pixel Remasters as a series has surpassed 5 million copies sold. It's important to remember that except for Dragon Quest III, the sales I am listing here are for the series, not individual titles. As a note, Dragon Quest XI just passed 8.5 million copies sold, which is fantastic, but the game came out almost 8 years ago and has been on a permanent sale for years, so it's really not representative of the current interest in turn-based games. Then I looked to Atlus. Though Persona 5 as a series sold over 10 million copies, I want to look at the main games. Persona 5 released almost 9 years ago and sold just over 3 million copies. Then Persona 5 Royal released 6 years ago and has gone on to sell about 4 million units. This is all really good, but what about their recent games? Well, Metaphor ReFantazio came out last year and was a Game of the Year contender. The initial sales seemed extraordinarily impressive, selling 1 million copies on day one. Then the sales were never updated again. If it went on to sell 2 or 3 million copies, they would have posted about it, but they never did. Now, you might argue that it's a new IP, and so obviously it would not have the same sales as if a Persona game released. I hear you, so let's look at Persona 3 Reload.
Did you just sneeze?
Persona 3 Reload came out last year and was a remake of the original game. It sold 1 million copies in its first week, which is very impressive, but again, there's no sales update after this point. Looking at circumstantial sales data, it's probably closer to 2 million in sales as of now, but regardless, the larger audience that was buying up Persona 5 is not here. And to be clear, there are turn-based games like turn-based strategy games that sell similarly. But outside of one game I'll mention in a moment when I discuss Outliers, turn-based strategy games are not the traditional turn-based games I've been discussing. Essentially, no matter where you look, most of the time you aren't going to see a turn-based game exceed 2 or 3 million in sales, at least not in the past few years. As a note, the remake of Super Mario RPG actually broke 3 million in sales, but given the popularity of Mario, it's not that surprising. However, there are 2 outliers when it comes to turn-based games. One is of course the Pokemon series, which continues to sell ungodly amounts of copies. The other is Baldur's Gate 3, which has sold over 15 million units. Now with Pokemon, I could argue that it's basically its own genre of game at this point. It goes beyond simply being considered a turn-based game. But what about Baldur's Gate 3? Well, there's 2 things. One, the combat here is definitely not the traditional turn-based combat I've been talking about, so this is not fitting in with the other games I've mentioned. Second, you may recommend playing Baldur's Gate 3 to other people because of the characters, story, world, etc. I've never heard anyone recommend this game because of the combat, and that's key here. The combat system takes a back seat to everything else I just mentioned, so its massive sales are not because of it being turn-based, even though it technically is a turn-based game. Now I can admit my argument against Pokemon and Baldur's Gate 3 here is not the best. But looking at the data, it's clear these are outliers when considering how many other turn-based games I can give as examples that sell only 1 or 2 million copies. And so, I thought my video was done. It's not a perfect argument, but there's a good amount of evidence showing that the audience for turn-based games is small, and arguably smaller than a few years ago when Dragon Quest XI and Persona 5 came out. But then Expedition 33 released. This new IP from a small studio is currently selling incredibly well. Not only were the sales strong initially, but 33 days after its release, the game had sold 3.3 million copies. What makes this all the more impressive is that it's a day one Game Pass game, and any gamers playing on Game Pass are not counted for sales because the studio is specifically saying copies sold. So, by now, it's safe to assume the game is nearing 4 million copies sold, or at least 4 million players if you include Game Pass. The thing is, Expedition 33 is bringing in many players who do not play that type of traditional turn-based game. Though it definitely has a quality story, characters, world, etc., its combat seems to be what intrigues new players, as it has real-time elements for attacking, dodging, and parrying. It brings something new and varied to turn-based combat, and gets gamers who otherwise don't play turn-based RPGs to try it. Without this game, I would have been quite a bit more negative viewing turn-based games from a sales perspective. Now, it's complicated. Is Expedition 33 an outlier or a trendsetter? Right now, it's hard to say. Expedition 33 is excellent and one of the frontrunners for Game of the Year. It's also $50, so there are definitely other factors at play here when it comes to its sales, not just its new type of turn-based combat. Regardless, I do love that this game is doing well. So, when it comes to the future, I think a good test would be to look at how well a bigger budget turn-based game sells, one that has traditional turn-based combat. If something like Final Fantasy XVII comes out, is reviewed well, is turn-based, but only sells 1 to 2 million units, it will say a lot. So, is turn-based dying? Well, right now, no, it's not. Even if Expedition 33 had not sold like it has, I don't think the situation was ever dire enough to say it was dying. However, whether or not the audience is growing or is consistently large remains to be seen. Regardless, there still seems to be a place for traditional turn-based games in the industry, and with lower budgets, these games will continue being successful for the foreseeable future. So, for the people saying turn-based is dying, it's not the case. But for the others who say turn-based is doing phenomenal and I am stupid for asking, thanks Reddit, that's not really the situation either. All I can say is that turn-based is doing fine, and if you are concerned about their success, buy those games and recommend them to other gamers who may not be initially interested. You never know who will find joy in them. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.